let's discuss forms. Forms on the web are like, for example, the forms you fill out to order a pizza. They ask for information, you give it to them, and then they do something with that information. Let's actually create a simple login form. First up is the form tag. It's a container for all the inputs and buttons. In the opening form tag, we add the action attribute. The action attribute tells the browser where to send the form data when the user submits the form. I'll paste this URL here. It points to a little PHP script I've prepared on my website. It's going to be the so-called backend that processes the form data we submit. This script will just simply show us the data we submitted. PHP is awesome. I'll cover PHP in future videos. You can use this URL in your forms to see the data you've submitted. This way, you don't need to go through all the hassle of installing and configuring a web server and PHP on your computer. Next, I'll set the method attribute. We need the method attribute to configure how to send the data to the server. Usually it's either get or post. With get, your answers are sent through the URL. With post, they are sent behind the scenes, which is more secure. I'll use post. And I recommend you always use post. It's a secure way to send data to the web server. If you don't add the method attribute, the browser will use the get method by default, which we don't want. Now let's add some fields to our form. For that, we use the input tag. Inputs are like blank fields on a form. The input tag is super versatile. We can have text fields, password fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, and more. To configure that, I'll use the type attribute. The type tells the browser what kind of information you're expecting. This field will be for the user's name, so text. Then we need to add the name attribute. The name attribute is for the server to recognize the data from this input. We can use whatever name we want. A good practice is to use a name that reflects what kind of information we expect from this input. In our case, it's the user's name. So I'll write user name. This is the camel case naming convention, where the first word is all lowercase and the following words start with a capital letter. Input is a self-closing tag, so I can just leave it like this. At this point, if I refresh the page, we have just an empty input box where I can type in something, like pizza guy. I can add the placeholder attribute to show some text when the input is empty. Let's put something like type in your login. Now it's better. And when I start typing something, the placeholder is gone. We can also set a default value for this input with the value attribute. I'll set pizza guy here. Now we have some initial value that the user can change. If I remove this value, we have our placeholder text here. Now let's add a password field. I'll add another input tag. This time the type will be password. The name attribute will be user password, camel case. Again, it's for the server to recognize the data from this input. I won't add the value attribute, so by default it's gonna have an empty value. The placeholder will be type in your password. Now we have one more field, and if I type in something, it's all hidden. Notice that both fields are on the same line. It's because inputs are inline elements. Well, they are actually inline block elements, but we'll discuss that more in a separate video for CSS. Let's add labels to our inputs. To create a label, we use the label tag and write the actual label in it. For email, I'll simply write user name : For password, it's gonna be password : Now it's more clear what to put inside those fields. Notice that everything stays on the same line. It's because labels by default are inline elements too. I want our labels to be on separate lines. For that, we could use the br tag after the text input, like this. Now it's on the next line. Or we could use paragraphs, which are block level elements and they start on the new line. Let's use them. I'll remove BR and I'll put our label input pairs inside paragraphs, like this. There you go. Notice that we have extra margin now because paragraphs have those margins by default. Now, if I remove these label tags, I'll still have the same text on the page. So why do we need to have label tags at all? That's because labels give us a cool feature. We can link a label to an input. For that, we'll use a couple of new attributes. Inside this label, I'll use the for attribute, which is going to be login user name, in camel case again. The second attribute we need is the ID attribute. In the input, we're linking our label to. We put the same value here as in the for attribute. Now, this label and this input are linked. One caveat. Make sure that this ID value is unique on this page. That is, no other element has the same ID. Otherwise, it won't work. Let's do the same for the password. I need to make sure that both the for attribute and the ID attribute have unique value. It's going to be login user password. The same for the ID here. Now, if I refresh the page, it seems that nothing has changed visually. But now if I click on the label, it focuses on this input, which means they are linked. The same for the password field. Labels make your forms easier to use, especially on mobile, and for people using screen readers. Also, this feature is very convenient with checkboxes and radio buttons, which we'll discuss in a minute. This is all great. We have our input fields, but how do we submit this form? We need a button to click. Let's add that. I want this button to be inside a paragraph too, just for visuals. To create the actual button, I can use, surprisingly, the input tag again, but the type will now be submit. And to set the text of this button, we use the value attribute. I'll write just log in. The submit button doesn't need to have a name, because it's not like it has any data to send to the server. It's just a button. When we click it, it packages up all the form data and sends it off to the server based on the form's action and method. Let's do that. For username, I'll type in pizza76. For password, it's going to be cheese. Submit. And there's our data. It's key value pairs, where the key is the input name and the value is the actual data that we typed into this input. There is our pizza76 for username and cheese for password. Let me go back and quickly type in different values. Now it's _soda_ for username and 3 a.m. in the morning for password. Submit. And there they are, our input values. And that's the basics of HTML forms. You start your form with the form tag, you put all the inputs inside. You add labels with the label tag. If this video was helpful, subscribe to get more. Now check out this next video.